Been a while since I did one of these, and you know what? I think it's time for something different. Let's get positive for once. Let's vote. So far in this series, I've mostly focused on the bad of trans representation in Hollywood. And that's kind of because that's the majority of the most high-profile examples. Trust me, I got plenty of material there, and yes, I will get to them. But I've been focusing on those ones for a reason. Those are often the ones most people see. I mean, some people may think of a trans woman as Eddie Redmayne or Jared Leto before ever even thinking of, say, a real trans person like myself. So it makes sense that poor representation will be a sadly large amount of this series. But I do think that sitting here and offering criticism without showing some good representation once in a while would be a bit of a bad idea. After all, it's easy to get mad at something, to point at something that's obviously wrong and say that it's wrong. It's much harder to explain why something works instead. So today we're going to disregard all the manufactured realities, all the forced performances and misunderstandings. In fact, let's ignore fiction altogether. Let's project some realness. Paris is Burning is a 1990 documentary by Jenny Livingston exploring the culture and the queer people of color who made up the scene. It was one of the biggest mainstream portrayals of queer life put to the screen at that time, and honestly since. For many young queer people, this was the first time they went to a movie theater and saw someone like them. I mean, this was 1990, 1991, just about when new queer cinema was about to ramp up. But prior to that, and this release, there was no Birdcage. No But I'm a Cheerleader, no My Private Idaho. You were lucky if an indie film like Morris would even be showing near you. At that time, you pretty much just had Rocky Horror. So to say this was a revelation at the time is putting it mildly. I mean, this was one of the most successful documentaries of all time. It made $4 million as an independent documentary during the peak of the AIDS crisis when queer people were still being treated as disease-ridden villains to the public at large. To be such an openly queer film at that time and be that critically acclaimed? It was a massive accomplishment. But already some of you may be raising your eyebrows. What is the ball scene? Ball culture focuses on the concept of balls. Please don't laugh. Or parties full of underground queer people performing or walking as specific fashion archetypes or general styles of performance, all divided into categories.
Upcoming Pretty Girl, 1986, take it to the floor. They're showing out for the press. Audience, please back up and give them air.
Next category, high fashion winter sportswear. The Poconos versus the Catskills. Is there anyone walking?
This came as a follow-up to the prevalence of drag culture in the community and drag balls, and a desire to similarly present performance as a manner of accepting themselves, while also representing a more underground phenomenon separate from the increasingly white drag balls that had become hostile to many who had formed this new ideal. The scene was made up mostly of black and brown queer people who had been kicked out of their homes, and often made this insular culture a home to themselves, with joining houses. Houses were essentially performance troupes of several categories that became, second, much more caring families to the members of the troupe. Since its inception, it has spread widely throughout the queer community, with most of it centering on the New York scene where it started, but since spreading all throughout the country. In a way, ball would come to represent the community, becoming one of the first popular safe spaces for queer people before it became mainstream, while also being heavily influential to the culture of music, fashion, and popular culture. In other words,
Ball is life.
with all that established, I think it's finally time to tackle the documentary itself. Now, the film is a documentary, and there isn't really an exact full narrative that we'll be following, but rather the film is split up into various discussions of the scene. So instead of a direct breakdown of how the story comes together and its visual components, we'll instead focus on having a conversation on what those discussions are and what they mean for the representation of the trans women that exist inside the film, and how those stories are told. And frankly, if there is one word that we should start off this conversation with, it's the one that comes up the most in this film. So much so, that is inside the Blu-ray case. Realness, as a concept, is one that embodies an essential part of the queer experience. One that embodies both stealth, but also honesty. The concept describes both a desire to fit in the society we exist in, but also a desire for that to no longer be necessary. There are certain elements of it that reflect a desire to exist without any queer identifiers, the idea often referred to in trans circles as going stealth, to keep your queer status a secret.
If you can pass the untrained eye, or even the trained eye, and not give away the fact that you're gay, that's when it's real.
But I think it'd be simplistic to view this as just another form of stealth or a desire to escape queerness. See, at this time, it had been less than a decade since New York's sodomy laws were taken off the books. Before then, you could be charged with a crime simply for having same genital sex, or even being seen as visibly queer. And it wouldn't be for over another decade after this film that the first anti-discrimination law for the LGBTQ community would be passed in the state. It was a time when if you were openly gay, you were openly poor. And if you were queer and poor in public, you could be under a lot of violence, particularly since we were not covered under any hate crime laws until 2001. Realness came from a desire to not be seen as a pariah in every aspect of their life that wasn't taking place in that ballroom. In that ballroom, they could be whoever they wanted as long as they embodied it and sold it. And the hopes were that one day they could walk outside that ballroom just as they were inside there and not be scared.
In real life, you can't get a job as an executive unless you have the educational background and the opportunity. Now, the fact that you are not an executive is merely because of the social standing of life. That is just a pure thing. Black people have a hard time getting anywhere. And those that do are usually straight. In a ballroom, you can be anything you want. You're not really an executive, but you're looking like an executive. And therefore, you're showing the straight world that I can be an executive. If I had the opportunity, I could be one, because I can look like one. And that is like a fulfillment. Your peers, your friends are telling you, oh, you make a wonderful executive.
Is this a businessman of the 80s or what?
In a way, it's unsurprising how much the term realness is repeated by the trans people of this film to reflect how they wish to be seen. They desire to be seen, loved, touched, perceived, and simply exist as the way they perceive themselves. To not be questioned. To be real. It's why terms like stealth exist. The desire to escape your transness, so you can be seen as just the gender you are, because somehow many people consider the trans part of yourself as disqualifying. It's the desire to exist without having to explain yourself. But then there is the other part of realness. The idea that one day we may not have to pretend ever again. That we can embody ourselves and that society won't question it. The idea, in my case, that one day my transness won't be all I am, but that it will be an accepted part of me that also doesn't take away from all the other parts of me. It's the same for many of the queer people of Paris is Burning. They desire to blend in because of the stares and the violence and the poverty. But when they're at a ball, they're in a world where they are not subservient to all of that stuff. One where you're allowed to exist with that one part of your identity just being a part of you. One where stealth need not exist at all. And one where every day we're not afraid that we'll be murdered for just daring to walk outside alone.
When they're undetectable, when they can walk out of that ballroom into the sunlight and onto the subway and get home and still have all their clothes and no blood running off their bodies, those are the femme realness queens.
To quote Michelle Parkinson for Criterion,
Realness is Paris's manifesto. Watching the exacting performances and outrageous mimicry of the American dream paraded on the ballroom floor, you witness brilliant works of individual survival and urban camouflage.
to me, there's nothing more real than staying true to yourself through all of that. When it comes to this film's legacy, the legacy of ball culture, and the legacy of queer history in general, it is impossible to touch on it without touching on the trans people that made it possible. Unless you're Roland Emmerich. Anyway...
No, Trevor! It's the only way! Gay power! Come on! Gay power!
And in many ways, the legacy of this film rests on the many, many stars of this film that exist under the trans umbrella. Octavia St. Laurent was non-binary before that was even a common term. Pepper LaBeija identified as male, but went by she/her pronouns, which is a form of non-binary presentation that I think deserves to be shown some respect on its own. Doreen Corey was a trans queen and admitted elder of the scene. And last but not least, there was Angie Extravaganza, trans woman and leader of the House of Extravaganza, which on its own include trans women members Brooke and Carmen Extravaganza, and most famously of all, Venus Extravaganza. Venus Extravaganza is a figure in trans circles that I've seen so many utterly inspired by. Her quotes might as well be written on my own skin from how much they perfectly fit how I and many others feel. For a person whose interviews took place in 1988 of all times, she reminds us that trans women were not a new thing, nor were just confused drag queens. In one of the most defining films of the community, there's Venus, describing our feelings in ways that feel simple yet perfect at capturing, well, emotions we've all gone through.
I don't feel that there's anything mannish about me, except maybe what I might have between me down there, which is my little personal thing, so I guess that's why I want my sex change, to make myself complete.
She didn't think of herself as cross-dressing or a drag queen like so many trans women before her had felt that they should identify at that time. She was a woman, and she was confident in herself. She was beautiful and knew it.
Touch this skin, darling. Touch this skin, honey. Touch all of this skin, okay? You just can't take it.
And she knew the dangers of the time, but also knew that there was some value in what she was, even if most didn't see it.
Some of them say that we're sick, we're crazy, and some of them think that we are the most gorgeous, special things on earth.
To quote Sherilyn Connolly,
even dressed at her most casual, she was graceful and utterly feminine because she was utterly herself. Venus participated in the drag balls because the House of Extravaganza was her chosen family, but at the end of the day, she was a woman. It was one of the strongest senses of wannabe I'd ever felt. Even though she was petite and thin while I was tall and thick, I wanted to be Venus Extravaganza when I grew up. Like my other deep, dark, secret transgender hero, Kelly Michaels, Venus didn't use wigs, but instead wore her own bleached blonde hair. Although Venus wanted what we now call bottom surgery, she didn't let genitals define her gender, which was another huge influence on me.
she in many ways presented herself in the film the way we all have wanted to be seen for a long time now, in a way that made her feel like a blueprint for all of us. Which makes her death in the documentary hit that much harder.
I always used to tell her, Venus, you take too many chances, you're too wild with people in the streets, something is gonna happen to you, but that was Venus. She always took a chance, she always went into a stranger's cars, she always did what she wanted to get what she wanted. I had a booking for a Christmas show at Sally's, and the DTs came to me with a picture of her murdered, and they were about to cremate her because nobody had came to verify the body, and I was the one that had to give all this information down to her family.
On December 24th, 1988, Venus Extravaganza was found murdered in a case that was never solved, most likely because sadly no one outside of her community cared about one of us dead at the time. Arguably, that's still the case with the fact that trans death counts are at their highest in history and the rise of trans panic. This is without mentioning the fact that in most states, the trans panic defense for murder is still allowed, including the very state I've lived in my entire life. Despite the depressing nature of her death, Venus embodied in many ways what trans women like me feel. A beauty inside us, the strength we gain when we realize that beauty, the feelings we felt we had to hide, and sadly, the lives we often have to live. And yet, in her, we found someone we wish to embody. I see many trans women saying they loudly are themselves because of people like her. And they often walk down the streets as themselves today, thinking about how she isn't here today, but how she desperately should be. But while Venus rightfully gets a lot of attention, as mentioned, she isn't the only trans woman in this film. In fact, one of my favorite scenes in the film was made at the last second because Jenny Livingston refused to have it cut. The scene is preceded by Pepper LaBeija talking about her personal refusal to get bottom surgery, admittedly implying it may be a mistake for many queens, when suddenly it cuts to the beach.
America's nice. You can do what you want if you have the money. You can be what you want, certainly. Look at me. In 84, I've had a nose reconstructed job. I've had my cheekbones risen. I've had a chin implant and breast implant.
Yes, tell them like it is.
The most important factor in my life that has been completed recently is that I've had a transsexualism operation. That means I've had a sex change. I'm no longer a man. I am a woman. I feel great. I'm very happy. And I feel like the part of my life that was a secret is now closed. I can close the closet door. There are no more skeletons in there. And I'm as free as the wind that's blowing out on this beach.
Except that voice is still there. As free as this beach.
I am my own special creation.
And that's the beauty of what Paris is Burning meant for representation. It was an avenue for allowing trans women and every other shade of the rainbow to speak for themselves without any insistence of dumbing down or appealing to a cishet audience. And this scene is a perfect capturing of pure gender euphoria. It's honest in a way many documents of transness refuse to be, because rarely do the people most affected by it speak for themselves. And that's why I think this scene, and this film in general, is such a great monument to transness and its history. But that's the thing with this film. It's undeniable the impact and legacy this film has left behind, and how important its moments are to the foundations of the modern queer community, but that isn't without criticism. More specifically, of the director. Jenny Livingston is essentially an outsider to everything this film is about. She's not gay, she's not trans, she was not poor or from Harlem, she hadn't participated in the ball scene at all prior, and unlike everyone I've mentioned from the film so far, she was not a person of color. And yet, she was the one who ended up getting all the interviews on TV, deal with Miramax, the fame, while her subjects, who in many ways made the film, remained poor. That is, see, while she did pay them for their time, it wasn't very much, and the performers would not get any residuals. As stated by Pepper LaBeija,
I love the movie. I watch it more than often, and I don't agree that it exploits us, but I feel betrayed. When Jenny first came, we were at a ball, in our fantasy, and she threw papers at us. We didn't read them because we wanted the attention. We loved being filmed. Later, when she did the interviews, she gave us a couple $100, but she told us that when the film came out, we would be alright. There would be more coming.
There indeed was not. Despite the film making that $4 million at the box office, the actual stars of the doc received none of it, and in fact had to engage in a legal battle with Miramax to be properly compensated, with them receiving $50,000 divided between the 13 performers, many of which who are not alive today. It's an issue that, as pointed out by fellow Brian Harper, stems mostly from the fact that often queer people of color are not even allowed even the opportunity to speak on their own, due to their low status in society.
What this means, of course, is that given the conditions they faced, any desire on the Queen's part to publicize widely their activities at the drag balls, and thus to achieve socially influential subjective agency, could be addressed only by their renouncing the very possibility of such agency in the first place. Specifically, by signing legal releases that provided for their becoming the subjects of documentary film, while simultaneously foreclosing the possibility of their becoming the productive subjects of significant social effects. The only way out of this catch-22 clearly would be to alter the conditions that dictate it. This would entail nothing other than the Queens amassing sufficient capital to effect their own wide publicization of drag ball practice. The resultant crossing from the localized public of the ballroom to the more extensive one implicated in mass cultural media would be critical in at least two ways, constituting a decisive juncture in the Queen's career as agential social objects, and conferring on their cultural commentary the edge that, in our eagerness to see their practice as subversive, we too easily forget it does not yet possess.
While all of this is happening, Madonna's Vogue is becoming one of the greatest hits of not only her career, but of all time. Seriously, the last all-time Billboard list ranked it as the 197th biggest hit in their chart's history. That is higher than American Pie, We Are the World, or Livin' on a Prayer. A song about ballroom made by an outsider was succeeding, while the ballroom scene was barely getting paid or credited for their work on their most mainstream project yet. And all of this is so disappointing because this film is made in many ways by this cast and Jenny's collaboration with them. Jenny Livingston made the brilliant choice of letting the participants in the documentary simply exist and explain themselves, with the only help from her being through the film's masterful editing. So it may not be fly on the wall or cinema verite, it feels almost more honest than that, because she knew when to simply let her subjects go, without feeling like she had to be a go-around or a translator for the cishet audience. And with her subjects free to be themselves, we get exposed to some of the most charismatic and incredible icons to ever grace the silver screen, and they help make the movie as iconic as it is. In a way, that very much is why this film is an enduring classic and why it's stuck with us for so long. Because while it may be with that baggage behind the scenes, the film we have here is still incredible. Still something we look up to and adore, that we reference when talking to each other. It's survived all this time for a very good reason, and it's still incredibly valuable for that reason.
I can be critical of Paris is Burning, but I'm so happy Paris is Burning also exists.
To quote Tav Nyong'o on the film,
"The film wouldn't still be controversial, after all, if it weren't such an enduring classic. It is a testament to the achievement of both Livingston and her subjects that thousands of people would show up a quarter of a century later to watch and cheer, many of us having memorized every line. Rather than standing in for ball culture, an unfair expectation of any single film, no matter how amazing, the film could be understood as a part of queer history, and specifically part of the ball culture's history, and even part of its futurity as well."
And in that survivability, there's something that we can appreciate. Even if parts of its legacy may not be as clean as others, what the film means to so many others and will for decades on is not soiled by any of that. It remains, like ball culture at large, eternal. Let me tell you a story about the title of the movie. It is said, though often debated by historians, that Hitler demanded that the Nazis destroy all of Paris before it fell back into Allied hands, with a shout of, "Is Paris burning?" Paris that day was indeed not burned, and instead the general surrendered, seen as a victory over the Nazis. But here in this film, that well-known phrase is flipped on its head and given a new meaning. Paris is, in fact, burning. but it's not Paris, France, but instead Paris Dupree's ball, which the film takes place during. It's burning with the performances and livelihood of every queer soul in that building, projecting realness and living with no judgment or fear for once in their lives. Since then, things have progressed in some manner, partially because of the exposure of many to works like this. It's still not perfect and still quite dangerous for people like me, but it's an improvement nonetheless. And yet, so many of the performers in this film have sadly passed. Nearly every person I mentioned so far by name has. And it's hard to think of how much history has been lost in our community and how many figures are no longer left standing. But for everyone in this film, queerness lives on. With me, with many of you in the audience, the spirit of the film is still wholly alive and with us. And I will do my best to make sure the flames that they started never go out.
It's the opposite of selfish. I'm not feeling angry, they want me to be so badly, but everything they don't do, we do so much better. So if we're sick and confused, let's stay like this forever. There's no one form of commitment, each situation's different. As the people in our lives, some things just cannot be defined. So let's go by what we want instead of what we're told we're meant to. Let's break this world apart and make a new one we consent to. One with clear communication, informed in every situation. I'll say today, no hesitation, you are my constellation.
I'd like to give a special thanks to my $10 a month patrons: Aerith, Maxibon, Paige, Felicity, Tegan B, Arif Hassan, Jonathan Palacio, Silas Ray, Cameron Kanaki, Corey Fui Maono, Daniel, Ben Birdperson, and Emily Pincus.